Whenever a narcissist wounds a super empath, they assume everything will continue following the same pattern they have always relied on to stay in control. They deceive, they disappear, they dominate, and then they repeat the cycle. What they fail to remember or truly grasp is that a super empath is not fragile, foolish, or dependent. They are people who have endured difficult experiences and, through those hardships, developed a far deeper understanding of human behavior than the narcissist could ever achieve. When you hurt someone like this, you are not simply breaking their trust. You are triggering a powerful transformation. It is the precise moment when the person who has carried all the emotional weight finally releases it, stands upright, and sees the narcissist with absolute clarity. That clarity is terrifying to the narcissist because nothing scares them more than someone who stops engaging in their games, refuses to be controlled, and understands the mask they hide behind better than they understand it themselves. The narcissist's betrayal awakens the super empath's awareness and completely shatters the illusion they once lived inside. For a long time, the super empath functions from a place of sincerity, loyalty, and high emotional awareness that others often mistake for weakness. They offer kindness not because they are soft, but because they deeply understand human pain and human nature. This understanding makes them patient, forgiving, and able to see beyond surface behavior. The narcissist misreads this entirely. They believe patience means ignorance, kindness means dependency, and strong emotions are tools that can be used without consequence. They assume the super empath sees life through the same unstable and reactive lens they do. They never realize that the empath's true strength comes from self-awareness and moral grounding. When the betrayal finally happens and the narcissist crosses the one boundary that cannot be repaired, something shifts inside the super empath. What emerges is not rage, resentment, or a need for revenge, but a calm so sharp it feels almost surgical. In that calm, a realization takes shape. The person they tried to help was never interested in healing, never capable of a balanced relationship, and never willing to return the loyalty they were given so freely. This realization arrives like a flood of light, illuminating every warning sign they once overlooked, every lie they excused, and every manipulation they allowed to pass in silence. In that instant, the fantasy collapses completely. The empath's mind begins replaying memories, not through emotion, but through facts, as if they are now observing the structure from the outside rather than being trapped within it. They see how the narcissist made empty promises, provoked unnecessary conflicts, and created chaotic cycles designed to keep them disoriented. They remember how affection was used as leverage, silence as punishment, and praise as a snare. They recognize the exact moments their intuition spoke up and how they ignored it because of their deep capacity to love. Now, with the betrayal fully exposed, that intuition becomes their most reliable guide, pointing them steadily toward truth. The pain becomes the spark that strips away every layer of deception the narcissist used to maintain power. The empath's emotional vision sharpens, and they begin to see the narcissist's behavior not as complicated trauma that needs rescuing, but as repetitive patterns of using others to feed a fragile ego. This awakening is intense because a super empath does not awaken halfway. Once the truth arrives, it is complete, final, and irreversible. They do not look back with longing or grief for what might have been, because their vision is no longer clouded by hope or imagined potential. They see the narcissist exactly as they are, someone who survives by draining others, someone terrified of authenticity, and someone who needs external validation to feel real. That clear sight changes everything instantly. The power the narcissist once held dissolves because the super empath is no longer participating in the emotional exchange. They stop absorbing blame. They stop believing distortions. They stop seeking validation. They stop reacting to provocations designed to unsettle them. The narcissist, who depended on emotional reactions to feel powerful, suddenly confronts someone who is no longer vulnerable to their tactics. This is deeply unsettling for the narcissist because control is the foundation of their identity. Without emotional dominance over the empath, they feel exposed, insignificant, and threatened. As clarity continues to grow, the super empath begins reclaiming the parts of themselves they slowly surrendered to keep the relationship alive. Confidence returns, intuition strengthens, boundaries become firm, self-worth becomes unshakable. They reconnect with their passions, their ambitions, and their own inner voice. They understand that their kindness is a strength, not a weakness, and that anyone who attempts to exploit it does not deserve access to it. With every new realization, the empath steps further out of the narcissist's psychological shadow. This shift does not happen through shouting or confrontation, but through quiet certainty. When truth arrives, the empath no longer needs explanations, apologies, or closure conversations. They already understand everything they need to know. The illusion is fully dismantled. And the narcissist, perhaps for the first time, realizes they have been seen in a way they cannot manipulate, deny, or talk their way out of. This is the moment when the balance of power reverses. The super empath stands grounded and secure in truth, while the narcissist clings desperately to the fragments of the false image they constructed. Without the empath's emotional energy to consume, without their attention to validate existence, and without their forgiveness to lean on, the narcissist begins to unravel internally. The traits they once used to dominate others now expose how hollow they truly are. They attempt to regain control using familiar tactics: sudden charm, guilt, anger, or playing the victim. But none of it works anymore because clarity has made the empath emotionally protected. The betrayal meant to weaken the empath becomes the very event that empowers them, while simultaneously dismantling the narcissist's inflated sense of superiority. The empath's clear perception becomes a mirror, and the narcissist cannot bear to face a reflection that reveals every insecurity, every falsehood, and every empty layer of their identity. Once this level of awareness exists, the relationship can never return to what it was. The super empath has finally seen the truth behind the mask the narcissist spent a lifetime constructing. A super empath walking away destroys the narcissist's control and exposes their vulnerability. Throughout the connection, the narcissist survives on the emotional energy exchanged between them and the empath. They depend on reactions, concern, and repeated attempts to fix things. Every tear, every explanation, every effort is interpreted as proof of dominance. They mistake emotional depth for entrapment and assume that because the empath cares so deeply, they will never leave. The narcissist's sense of authority is built on the belief that the empath will always come back, always forgive, and always seek harmony. What they never anticipate is the quiet ending, when the empath stops responding entirely. When the empath withdraws, it is not driven by anger, but by understanding. This moment shocks the narcissist because they believe their hold is permanent and that the empath is bound by kindness rather than guided by truth. When the super empath pulls away, it is not dramatic, loud, or demanding change. It is a silent reclaiming of their own energy, a shift so profound it destabilizes the narcissist's carefully maintained reality. Suddenly, there is no reaction to control, no narrative to distort, and no emotion to weaponize. The empath refuses the role the narcissist assigned them, creating a void the narcissist cannot tolerate. Their identity depends on managing emotional dynamics, and without that power, they lose their footing. They resort to old behaviors, provoking reactions, inducing jealousy, stirring conflict, or alternating between affection and cruelty, all in an attempt to recreate the chaos that once sustained them. But the empath no longer responds with the same openness. Their silence becomes the most powerful message they could send. That silence exposes the narcissist's internal emptiness. Without the empath's emotional supply, the void inside becomes impossible to ignore. It feels like psychological suffocation because the empath's absence highlights just how dependent the narcissist truly was. The person who believed themselves superior now realizes they relied on the empath for validation, control, and emotional regulation. The empath's departure reveals how little substance the narcissist actually possesses, and that realization triggers panic. They may pretend not to care, seek new people to exploit, or present themselves as victims to others, but nothing truly fills the emptiness left behind. The narcissist does not miss the empath as a person with feelings, depth, or humanity. What they miss is the control, the reactions, and the emotional energy they once extracted so effortlessly. When the empath steps away, it also fractures the narcissist's internal narrative. Narcissists construct stories of superiority, dominance, and invincibility. And those stories only survive if other people continue to play assigned roles. When the empath stops participating, the story collapses. The narcissist can no longer convince themselves that the empath is obsessed, desperate, or trapped. The silence forces them to face a truth they deeply fear. The empath never truly needed them. They begin to realize that the drama, manipulation, and power struggles only felt real because the empath kept engaging. Without that participation, the narcissist is left in a silence that feels humiliating. Their sense of power begins to fade, and their self-image starts to crack. Walking away becomes the empath's greatest strength because it demands emotional discipline. It is the choice of peace over chaos, boundaries over self-erasure, and truth over confusion. The empath is not trying to punish the narcissist. They are choosing themselves. Their energy turns inward to heal, rebuild, and reconnect with who they were before the narcissist's influence dimmed their light. This withdrawal corners the narcissist mentally because it denies them what they crave most: attention and control. Narcissists thrive on emotional cycles, and the empath's refusal to re-enter those cycles disrupts the rhythm they depend on. Without emotional dominance, the narcissist begins to unravel. Their attempts to pull the empath back grow more frantic. They may return with apologies, false promises, sudden affection, or dramatic declarations of love, but the empath, now fully aware, sees through it. They recognize manipulation hidden beneath charm. Kindness that once kept them stuck is now guided by insight instead of obligation. They understand that true change is impossible for someone who treats relationships as tools rather than connections. Distance becomes a shield that protects them from falling back into draining patterns. As the space widens, The narcissist's fragility becomes more obvious. Their emotions grow erratic. Their mask slips more frequently. They lash out, blame others, or collapse into self-pity because they cannot comprehend how they lost control over someone they believed they owned. This is when their instability becomes undeniable. They are exposed not only to the empath, but to themselves. They are forced to face the reality that their power was never authentic. It was borrowed from the emotional generosity of the very person they tried to break. The narcissist's downfall begins with this withdrawal because nothing terrifies them more than becoming irrelevant. The empath's silence represents independence, a solid boundary, and a refusal to be used. It marks a shift in power that cannot be undone. Once the empath gains clarity and removes their emotional investment, the dynamic is permanently altered. The narcissist, stripped of control, must confront the emptiness they spent their entire life avoiding. That confrontation marks the start of their inner collapse. Betrayal awakens the super empath's inner strength, transforming pain into resilience. Inside every empath exists a quiet toughness that remains hidden until it is pushed too far. The narcissist, convinced of their emotional superiority, never imagines their betrayal will activate that strength. They assume sensitivity equals weakness, but sensitivity is awareness, and awareness evolves into power. When the lies unravel, when betrayal strikes, and when the empath finally understands what has been done to them, something powerful rises. A determination to reclaim their life, to stop shrinking, and to stop overgiving. Pain becomes the spark that ignites a deeper truth. Their worth was never measured by how much they could endure, but by the strength that existed within them all along. At first, the pain feels shocking, not because the empath was unaware, but because the reality finally lands. They stop accepting blame that was never theirs. They stop explaining themselves to someone who refuses to listen. Each boundary becomes a source of power. Each truth becomes a form of freedom. Pain that once felt unbearable transforms into a blueprint for change. It sharpens perception, strengthens resolve, and reconnects them with parts of themselves they once silenced. As their strength grows, the empath begins to recognize patterns they once misunderstood. They see how flattery created dependency, how silence produced fear, and how chaos was used to maintain control. They recognize how kindness was exploited, how love was distorted, and how forgiveness was weaponized. This awareness does not weaken them, it empowers them. For the first time, they step out of mental confusion and into clear reality. They no longer feel obligated to rescue, justify, or sacrifice themselves. Betrayal becomes the final lesson that carries them into genuine strength. The empath's transformation unsettles the narcissist because it is quiet and unstoppable. Emotions can be manipulated, but awareness cannot. Once awareness arrives, the illusion breaks. There is no argument, charm, or guilt capable of pulling the empath back into the old cycle. The empath grows stronger not through confrontation, but through detachment. They focus on healing and personal growth. They return to interests they abandoned, rebuild connections they neglected, and realign with values they once compromised. Every day away becomes an investment in themselves. Their strength is not driven by resentment, but by understanding. They realize the betrayal was never about them. It was a reflection of the narcissist's inner emptiness. That realization becomes armor. The empath becomes calm, steady, and emotionally balanced. Reactions become intentional. Feelings become regulated. A composed presence emerges that the narcissist cannot disrupt. demonstrating real emotional mastery. As the empath stabilizes, the narcissist loses control of the narrative. They can no longer portray the empath as weak or confused. The empath's growth forces the narcissist to confront boundaries they have avoided their entire life. The power shift is undeniable. The narcissist becomes increasingly unstable because they cannot understand how the empath is no longer affected. They attempt to provoke reactions and receive nothing. They try guilt and it is immediately recognized. They try perfection and it feels hollow. What the narcissist experiences as abandonment is, for the empath, liberation. Pain becomes the teacher, and growth becomes the victory. Betrayal marks the beginning of a stronger identity that no longer seeks approval. The empath becomes emotionally independent, drawing strength from wisdom and lived experience. Boundaries solidify, intuition sharpens, self-respect becomes non-negotiable. They rise from betrayal not as someone damaged, but as someone transformed. This strength cannot be shaken. This is a turning point the narcissist cannot reverse. The empath's power shines in ways the narcissist cannot imitate or control. They become more emotionally intelligent, more self-aware, and more grounded in truth. Their clarity exposes deception. Their strength neutralizes manipulation. Their presence proves what the narcissist failed to destroy. The narcissist watches this transformation with confusion, unable to comprehend how the pain they caused became the source of the empath's strength. The empath, now fully awake, moves forward with clarity and resilience that only comes from surviving deep emotional wounds. When the super empath withdraws, the narcissist permanently loses their source of praise. The empath's presence was not merely supportive, it was psychological fuel. The narcissist fed on validation, admiration, attention, and emotional warmth. The empath naturally noticed details others overlooked, offered comfort without being asked, and brought emotional depth the narcissist could not generate alone. That richness became the narcissist's sense of importance, and they grew dependent on it, assuming it would never disappear. They viewed the empath as an endless supply of loyalty and care. But that supply is not infinite. It is sustained by respect, honesty, and balance. When betrayal or cruelty destroys that foundation, praise does not fade gradually. It stops completely. The narcissist mistakes compassion for weakness. They treat kindness as permission to exploit rather than a gift to honor. They assume devotion equals ownership. They believe the empath will always admire them because they confuse empathy with desperation. Pulling away shatters that illusion. Praise becomes inaccessible, not out of revenge, but because clarity replaces admiration. Genuine respect cannot coexist with awareness. Once the empath understands the narcissist's motives, behaviors, and inner emptiness, praise transforms into understanding, and understanding dissolves the spell. Withdrawal is not merely a reaction, it is a fundamental shift in perception. The empath stops viewing the narcissist as someone to save and begins seeing them as someone responsible for their own actions. They stop carrying emotional weight that was never theirs and start protecting their own well-being. That inner shift cuts off the flow of admiration. The empath stops idealizing potential. They stop excusing harm for the sake of hope. They stop mistaking emotional chaos for love. Pulling away restores logic, strengthens boundaries, and permanently changes how they see the narcissist. The narcissist senses this shift immediately. They notice fewer reactions, less praise, and limited emotional access. Anxiety sets in because their identity depends on being admired. They need validation as desperately as air. Without that validation, their self-image begins to crumble. They attempt to restart the praise using familiar tactics such as charm, apologies, empty promises, or displays of power and success, but none of it works anymore. The empath's clear awareness filters it out completely. Losing that praise devastates the narcissist because it was their emotional lifeline. Without it, they feel insignificant, invisible, and unimportant. A deep emptiness surfaces, one that cannot be filled by shallow attention or new sources of admiration. The praise the empath once gave was different. It was sincere, deep, organic, and soothing. It made the narcissist feel special in a way ordinary compliments never could. When it disappears, it leaves a wound they cannot repair. They search for substitutes, but every new form of attention feels hollow compared to what they lost. The more they chase it, the more they realize how rare and irreplaceable it truly was. Pulling away also means the empath no longer supports the narcissist's personal narrative. They stop reacting to accusations. They stop defending themselves. They stop entering emotional cycles designed to drain them. A narcissist cannot extract power from someone who refuses to engage. Without participation, emotional dominance dissolves. The narcissist grows frantic, shifting between rage, desperation, arrogance, and self-pity. Yet the empath remains grounded. Their energy is no longer accessible. The narcissist's tactics become obvious and predictable. The empath recognizes them for what they are, desperate attempts to reclaim control. As the distance continues, the empath begins redirecting that praise inward. They give themselves the validation they once gave away. Energy that was poured into maintaining the narcissist is now invested in healing, growth, and rediscovering identity. This redirection strengthens the empath further and makes reconciliation impossible. The narcissist observes this transformation and feels increasingly irrelevant. They know the empath's admiration was the pillar holding the entire dynamic together, and without it, everything collapses. They feel exposed, powerless, and hollow. Their identity fractures because it was built on external validation rather than inner substance. The hardest reality for the narcissist is that genuine admiration and empathy cannot be forced, manipulated, or performed. They must be earned through honesty, stability, and authentic character, qualities the narcissist does not possess. The empath's distance becomes undeniable proof. The narcissist was never as powerful as they believed. Their influence existed only because of the empath's emotional investment. When that investment ends, the narcissist is left alone, face to face with the self they spent a lifetime avoiding. Pulling away becomes the moment they realize they lost something they can never recover. No charm, control, or manipulation can repair what they destroyed. The narcissist's decline begins the moment the super empath stops responding emotionally, because emotional reaction is the narcissist's lifeblood. They depend on it for validation, control, and a sense of importance they cannot generate on their own. Every emotional response, sadness, anger, confusion, or affection, is interpreted as proof of influence. They rely on the empath's emotional depth to feel meaningful. Intense feelings, predictable reactions, and constant drama reinforce their fantasy of dominance. When reactions cease, a psychological void opens, like cutting off the power source sustaining their ego. The empath's stillness is not performative. It reflects a deep internal shift. They detach internally first. They stop allowing the narcissist's moods and words to define their inner state. The change is quiet but enormous. They observe instead of absorbing. They identify patterns instead of assuming responsibility. They recognize manipulation instead of labeling it misunderstanding. Old triggers lose effect, and without reaction, control vanishes. The empath's silence becomes an undeniable truth the narcissist cannot escape. It forces them to confront their lack of significance. Emotional neutrality terrifies the narcissist because it exposes how empty their influence really was. In the past, reactions made them feel powerful. Now, silence reveals the truth. Their power was borrowed and only existed because the empath participated. This realization triggers panic, anger, and desperation. They escalate behavior, becoming louder, harsher, sweeter, or more pitiful, cycling through every strategy they know. Each failure increases their distress. The absence of response exposes their emotional dependency. They believe themselves dominant, unforgettable, and superior. Silence proves they depended on the empath to survive emotionally. Their self-image collapses, leaving them feeling unseen, irrelevant, and diminished. The empath's withdrawal becomes a mirror reflecting the emptiness the narcissist spent their life running from. Without feedback, the narcissist cannot gauge vulnerability or confirm whether tactics are working. They lose control of the narrative. Words lose influence. Gestures lose meaning. Their presence loses weight. The empath's calm becomes a shield the narcissist cannot penetrate. The narcissist has no strategy for emotional closure because their entire system relies on open emotional access. When that access ends, they are powerless. As the empath disengages, they begin rediscovering themselves. The space once consumed by anxiety and confusion becomes space for reflection. They reconnect with values, inner strength, and intuition. This grounding further reduces reactivity. Emotions stabilize, thoughts clarify. Healing begins internally. That healing weakens the narcissist's influence even more. A healed empath cannot be controlled by an unhealed narcissist. The narcissist tries switching masks, appearing remorseful, detached, or enraged, but none of it works. The empath no longer believes emotional performances. They see tactics instead of truth. Confusion no longer works, and confusion was a core weapon. Without it, manipulation collapses. Immunity marks the beginning of the narcissist's internal breakdown. Silence also dismantles the narcissist's sense of superiority. When the empath stops reacting, the narcissist questions their charm, power, and identity. Insecurity grows because silence feels like rejection, and rejection threatens their entire internal structure. As distance increases, they unravel, becoming impulsive and unstable. They attempt punishment, but it fails because the empath no longer fears abandonment. They try to provoke jealousy, but it fails because the empath no longer seeks approval. They attempt love bombing, but it feels empty and false. Every tactic loses impact. Every strategy becomes useless. They realize they are powerless, not because the empath is cruel, but because the empath is awake. Emotional neutrality becomes independence. It signals that the narcissist no longer occupies space in the empath's heart or mind. It confirms that emotional freedom has returned, and that loss of influence becomes the narcissist's greatest defeat. Love, respect, and admiration cannot be forced from someone who sees clearly. When emotional reaction ends, their power ends with it. When the narcissist realizes the person they underestimated and tried to diminish has stepped into genuine emotional strength, a quiet panic takes hold. That growth dismantles the false reality they built to maintain control. They sense that the bond they relied on, the access they enjoyed, and the validation they quietly consumed are gone. That loss shakes them more deeply than they will ever admit because their ego depends on believing they are unforgettable and always needed. They search for ways to reinsert themselves into your life, not because they have changed, but because your resilience threatens the foundation of their self-image. Their deepest fear is becoming irrelevant in a life they once dominated with ease. Your transformation becomes a mirror reflecting their insecurity, fragility, and inability to form genuine connection. That truth hurts more than any confrontation ever could because it proves their influence was never permanent. As your energy shifts, they feel the hollow space where your empathy and effort once existed. That void becomes impossible to ignore because it reveals how dependent they were on the emotional supply you gave freely. Without you, they cannot recreate the nourishment you provided because their connections lack depth and authenticity. Your absence exposes how empty their other relationships truly are. Their internal response becomes fear, envy, regret, and desperation, but they will never admit it. Admitting it would require self-awareness, and self-awareness is what they avoid at all costs. Instead, they observe from a distance, pretending indifference while privately struggling with the reality that they pushed away the one person who genuinely cared and saw worth even when it was undeserved. Your confidence highlights their instability. Your clarity reveals their chaos. Your self-love exposes the hollowness of the persona they hide behind. That contrast becomes silent torment because it forces them to confront the life they might have had if they were capable of real connection. As you continue to grow, they live with an irreversible loss, not of you as a person, but of the emotional power they once accessed through you. That loss becomes one of the few things that truly reaches them. Even if they cannot express it in a healthy way, your growth becomes an unexpected consequence they never anticipated. It demands nothing from you, no revenge, no confrontation, no explanations, only the quiet expansion of your strength, which reminds them of everything they tried to suppress within you. Their fear increases as they recognize you have become someone they can no longer control, influence, or diminish. That realization marks the final shift in power, leaving them to face an emptiness no new source of supply can ever fill.